What is one of the most important acquisitions made by the Catholic Church during the papacy of Pope Francis? Honestly, I have no idea. But I'm confident if I asked 100 Catholics, none of them would list firearms. But during the papacy of Pope Pius IX, the acquisition of more than 15,000 Remington rolling block rifles was arguably one of the most symbolically important during his pontificate. The history of those firearms and the Pope's acquisition of them coming up on this episode of Catholic History Trek.
God bless America.
God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you. They will be the concluding words on each broadcast.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president.
Annuncio optis Gaudium Magnum. Habemus Papam.
You've embarked on a Catholic history trek.
Most firearms work on a principle that you ignite gunpowder, which then launches a projectile down a barrel and towards a target. That really hasn't changed since the Franciscan Berthold Schwarz supposedly invented the first firearm. Catch episode 66 for more on that. But everything else has changed about firearms, especially the way and speed at which those projectiles are loaded. The oldest firearms were muzzle-loaded, meaning you load the projectile from the end of the barrel, which the bullet exits the firearm. Essentially what one would imagine with Revolutionary War or American Civil War long guns. It was a slow, cumbersome process, which begged for inventors to conceive of improvements. One of those improvements came in 1863 when a Remington employee developed what has been called the Remington rolling block. It allowed one to easily and quickly breech load the weapon, meaning you loaded the bullet from the end of the barrel closest to the stock and the trigger, not from the far end of the barrel. There were many advantages to this design, and more than 1 million such rolling block rifles were produced for both military and civilian use. The design was so favorable that it remained in production from 1864 up through the mid-1930s. In 1913, the Remington rolling block was even selected by American Boy Scout as their official military-style single-shot firearm, beating out designs from Winchester and other manufacturers. The American Boy Scout organization is not to be confused with the modern Boy Scouts of America. A century ago, there were 3 prominent Boy Scouting groups in the United States: Boy Scouts of America, Boy Scouts of the United States, and American Boy Scout. It was the latter of these who adopted this firearm as their official Boy Scout firearm. Knowing they had a great product, the Remington brothers went through Europe promoting their new firearm and looking for subcontractors to produce the Remington design under a license agreement. In 1867, they met Leon and Emile Nagant, a pair of Catholic brothers who had recently opened a metal fabrication and repair business in Liège, Belgium. Although their business was initially focused on industrial equipment, they also repaired a number of firearms for local manufacturers. Their firearm experience and high production quality earned them a coveted contract with Remington. A quarter century later, the Nagant brothers would team up with Colonel Sergei Ivanovich Mosin to develop the world-famous Mosin-Nagant rifle, produced from 1891 through 1973, primarily for Russia and later the Soviet states. 37 million of these Mosin-Nagant rifles were built, and have seen action in just about every single war over the past 125 years. Around the time the Nagants were contracted with Remington, the Italian peninsula was going through a major political and military takeover. Victor Emmanuel and Giuseppe Garibaldi were conquering the independent Italian kingdoms in what they dubbed the Risorgimento, or resurrection, of a unified Italy. The last holdout in their takeover were the Papal States, under the leadership at that time of Pope Pius IX. The states had always relied on mercenaries and alliances with foreign armies to protect the Papal States from these power-hungry aggressors. The most famous of these mercenaries are the Swiss Guard, who we cover in episode 42. And in the 1860s, an alliance with France provided French military support to defend the Papal States. Additionally, the Pope also had his own soldiers, the most notable of which were the Papal Zouaves, who were a light infantry consisting of young, unmarried Catholic men who volunteered to defend the Pope and the States from the enemies of the Church. The composition of the Zouaves, which reached 4,500 men by 1868, was a mix of nationalities and languages, with the Dutch, French, and Belgians composing about 85% of their ranks. In 2023, when one looks at a list of Vatican offices within the Roman Curia, they will find dicasteries of evangelization, doctrine of the faith, divine worship and discipline of sacraments, the causes of the saints, for clergy, and for consecrated life, but one will not find a dicastery or department of war. The idea might sound odd today, but 150 years ago, when the new Kingdom of Italy threatened the very life of the Church and her states, Pope Pius IX had such a department. The Pope appointed German General Hermann Kanzler as the head of the Papal War Ministry, and Kanzler wasted no time implementing a series of reforms to improve the condition of the Papal armies, including modern field hospitals and additional marksmanship training. Another reform Kanzler needed to implement was standardizing the wide variety of ammunition calibers and updating the outdated firearms in use by the Papal armies. In 1867, Kanzler led a mix of Papal forces and their French allies in an impressive victory over the invading Italian forces at the Battle of Mentana. Apparently during this battle, Kanzler recognized the superior breech-loading rolling block rifles used by the French and realized equipping the Papal armies with these rifles would resolve the issue caused by the hodgepodge of ammunition and outdated firearms. So, under Pope Pius IX, an order was placed for 5,000 of the Remington rolling block breech-loading rifles, the finest military firearms of their day. Paid for by donations from Belgian Catholics, the order was fulfilled by the Catholic Nagant Brothers of Belgium, and it was their first production of the Remington patent. Pope Pius IX's rolling block rifles had the papal symbol of St. Peter's keys and the triple tiara stamped on the firearms, along with the name of the Belgian Catholic organization who donated them. Additional rolling block rifles were ordered for the Pope, mostly by way of donations from Catholic organizations in France, Germany, and Austria, which were produced by various licensed rolling block contractors. Although the largest contribution of rifles for the defense of the papacy came from the Belgian Catholic organization, who also purchased 2 million rounds of ammunition. In total, Pope Pius IX acquired nearly 16,000 rolling block rifles for his papal armies in a bold stand against the progressive, tyrannical enemies of the Church. In addition to these 16,000 rifles for military use, Pope Pius IX also received 80 ornately decorated rolling block rifles from the Nagant Brothers factory. They were a gift from 80 wealthy Belgian Catholic families. One went to the Pope, another went to his war minister Kanzler, and the remaining 78 rifles went to the Noble Guard, a personal bodyguard in one of the units covered in episode 27 as part of the armies of the papacy. It's possible 12 of these rolling block rifles given to the Pope from Emile and Léon Nagant were engraved with the name of an apostle, a common tradition with papal heavy weaponry, as each of the Pope's artillery pieces was named for a saint, although none of those rifles survived, so the claim can't be verified. The Papal Zouaves went on to train with the new rifles, which were a vast improvement over their previous firearms. This sentiment was captured in the book 2 Years in the Papal Zouaves, which was written by Joseph Powell, a former Zouave from England, who wrote the line, "The Remington rifle is very simple, light, and we are able to fire very rapidly with it." Unfortunately for the Papal States, the Franco-Prussian War pulled the French troops from the Papal States, forcing them to fend for themselves against the much larger Kingdom of Italy, who used this to their advantage in September of 1870 in their final assault on Rome and the Church. Desperately outnumbered, the Papal Zouaves used the rolling block's high rate of fire to inflict a disproportionate number of casualties on the attacker, as they fought off waves of advancing Italian soldiers, until finally, on September 20th, Pope Pius IX ordered the surrender of Rome and the Papal States to the Kingdom of Italy, signaling the end of more than well over 1,000 years of papal authority. And for more on the history of the Papal States and their fall, check out episode 40. The Italian army confiscated most of the Pope's 16,000 rolling block rifles for their own military use, although the Noble Guard were allowed to keep their elaborately crafted rifles, one-third of which currently reside in the armory of the Swiss Guard. In the 1880s, as the Italians updated their arsenal with firearms of Italian manufacture, they sold off many of the confiscated papal rolling block rifles, 5,000 of which they sent to Ethiopia. And, interestingly enough, these rifles would have their revenge against the Kingdom of Italy. 1 decade later, in 1896, Italy invaded Ethiopia, where they were defeated by Menelik II at the Battle of Adwa, and the Pope's rifles, which had been ordered by Pope Pius XI for the purpose of driving back the invading Italian army, did just that in the hands of Menelik soldiers. In 1935, these papal rifles made another appearance when Italy again invaded Ethiopia, although by this time the design was 70 years old and the Pope's rifles were unable to repel the Italian invaders. Although this rarity, a successful Italian military campaign in the World War II era, would be short-lived. After World War II officially began, the British kicked Italy out of Ethiopia. The papacy of Blessed Pius IX is often underappreciated, as it was the longest papacy after St. Peter, and some pretty weighty doctrines were decreed during his reign. He was the Pope who convened the First Vatican Council, which proclaimed papal infallibility, and he was also the Pope who dogmatically defined the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And he also acquired over 15,000 of the most potent rifles of the day to equip his papal army of young Catholic men who were dedicated to protecting the Church from her enemies. And while this acquisition was not made ex cathedra, it does seem to have been a pretty strong statement regarding the Church's position on Catholics and gun ownership. Speaking of which, if you are a Catholic gun maker like Leon and Emile Nagant and would like to gift Kevin and myself with 1,000 rifles, I suppose we'd happily accept your gift, but we would be just as happy, almost, if you could take a brief moment to subscribe to Catholic History Trek and offer a rating or review. And as always, we would greatly appreciate it if you would share it with others who may find it interesting to learn about an international arms-dealing pontiff and other interesting aspects of Catholic history. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.